entitled Global Cultural Environmental Justice, Transdisciplinary and Transcultural Perspectives, which is being co-hosted by the Imagining Climate Change Initiative and the Sustainable Online Network for Global Cultural Studies, or the SONGS Initiative at the University of Florida. The Imagining Climate Change Initiative works to engage artists, humanists, scientists, educators, students, and the public in the vital work of imagining our collective climate futures. The SONGS Initiative works towards the construction of a sustainable, which is to say self-powering, online global cultural studies network. So in its own way, it seeks engagements also among scholars in the arts, humanities, sciences, and other fields that might contribute to the construction of such a network. My name is Will Hasty. I'm professor of German and Medieval and Early Modern Studies in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. And I am a founder of the SONGS Initiative. Events of past years hosted by ICC and by SONGS have been in-person events, of course, and this year, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have decided to move to this webinar format in order to make sure that we're keeping everybody as safe as possible. I would like to mention at the outset that besides this first symposium event tonight, there will be 3 more webinars in the month of October. And in conjunction with the webinars, in which we encourage the participation of interested faculty and students, this symposium also includes a global cultural environmental justice poetry slam with numerous prize categories, including single author and collaborative submissions, as well as submissions in 1 or more languages. The Poetry Slam has been made possible by the generosity of the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany as part of their ongoing Campus Weeks initiative. Poetry Slam submissions are due on October 25th at midnight, and winners will be announced and perform their poetry at the Poetry Slam grand finale scheduled on the evening of November 9th, which happens also to be the date commemorating the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I have inserted information, by the way, in the chat box, the websites for both the webinars and the Poetry Slam, in case you would like to refer to those later. Tonight's event sets a pre-modern stage for the transdisciplinary and transcultural considerations of environmental justice that will continue over the next weeks. With tonight's guest speaker, Dorothy Ko, we are able to begin to address questions pertaining to environmental justice from truly transcultural perspectives. Dorothy Ko is professor of history at Barnard College of Columbia University, and as a cultural historian of early modern China, her research has focused on gender, bodies, material cultures, and technology. For example, in her earlier monographs, such as Teachers of the Inner Chambers, Women and Culture in 17th Century China, published by Stanford University Press in 1994. Every Step a Lotus, Shoes for Bound Feet, published by the University of California Press in 2001. And Cinderella's Sisters, a revisionist history of foot binding, published by the University of California Press in 2005. Besides 2 edited volumes dealing with feminisms in China, published in 2007 and 2013, Professor Ko's most recent significant scholarly contribution, which extends the above-mentioned concerns in different directions, has been her monograph with the very intriguing title, The Social Life of Inkstones, Artisans and Scholars in Early Qing China, published by the University of Washington Press in 2017. To convey an impression of how well her last book was received, this is the appraisal of Dagmar Schäfer. Quote, "A master of her trade, Ko draws on artifacts and texts to unfurl Qing material, intellectual and social life. She enlivens a world in which inkstones constituted hidden treasures and constant companions for daily use, guiding us into the dark pits and workshops, the collector's studio, and imperial halls. Ko presents a fine example of how gender, regional studies, and the history of technology should be combined. A feast for any historian of material cultures, the arts, and crafts," end quote. While working on the social life of inkstones, Professor Ko realized the need to branch out and consider farming and manufacturing as interrelated activities, as well as to include such non-human agents as stones, soil, metals, and trees into our historical accounts. This realization has led to current research projects on the environmental history of early modern China, using the four vectors of earth, humans, wind, and water as navigation guide. We have the great good fortune that Professor Ko will be presenting to us today from this more recent environmental research. I would like at this point of time also to introduce our UF colleague, Anna Peterson, who has kindly agreed to respond to Dorothy Ko's presentation. Anna Peterson is professor in UF's Department of Religion, and I was very happy that she was willing to be respondent because some of her principal scholarly concerns place her so close to the ones on which we are interested in this symposium. For example, among her many books is one with the title Everyday Ethics and Social Change, The Education of Desire, Columbia University Press 2009, and her ethical concerns become more patently connected to sustainability in her co-edited volume published in 2011 titled Working Towards Sustainability, Ethical Decision-Making in a Technological World, published with Wiley Press in 2011. I would like finally to mention Professor Peterson's book, Being Animal, Beasts and Boundaries in Nature Ethics, also published by Columbia University Press in 2013. Another of the reasons that I'm delighted Professor Peterson was willing to be respondent to Professor Ko was the prospect of being able to widen our pre-modern considerations to include both the largely Oriental cultural perspectives of Professor Ko and the largely Occidental cultural perspectives of Professor Peterson. This should make this webinar dealing with pre-modern perspectives on global cultural environmental justice, I think, truly a transcultural and transdisciplinary event, and I look forward to an interesting and lively discussion. And with this, I would like to turn things over to Professor Ko.
Thank you very much. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes.
Yes, very well, thank you.
Okay, East meets West, and without a carbon footprint. You've got to love the pandemic. Environmental justice is such an urgent issue in our age of climate change that it truly affects everybody in the here and now. So I am particularly thankful to Will and Terry, the organizers of this symposium, for giving me a chance to introduce perspectives that may seem very far removed from ours, from a non-Western place, China, and from a time before the industrialization. So I plan to do so by telling stories about the entanglements of four elements: earth, human, wind, and water, some visible, some not so visible. We would begin our journey in the US and then spend some time visiting contemporary China before arriving at our destination, which is knowledge about the art of survival passed on by rice farmers who have lived for a millennium on the fringes of empires. In 1994, President Clinton issued an executive order calling each federal agency to, quote, address environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. I highlighted, underlined minority population and low-income population on his executive order because it was remarkable that he focused his attention on the poor, people of color, and the disenfranchised. The rich get richer and the poor get their byproducts, as Steve Greenberg's comic strip says it in so many words. The definition of environmental justice, if you were to turn to the Environmental Protection Agency's website today, however, said something slightly different. Environmental justice, according to this definition, is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origins, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards and equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. The sleight of hand changing Clinton's emphasis on minority populations and low-income populations in the hands of Bush to all people and everyone is interesting. And in the Q&A, I'll be curious to hear from some of you whether this sleight of hand is similar or related to the change from Black Lives Matter to All Lives Matter. I think there is some room for discussion here. In any case, the very fact that laws protecting environmental justice have to be devised can only mean one thing, and that is, in reality, the opposite is quite true. Pollution is segregated, as Dr. Robert Bullitt puts it, again, in so many words. As such, in the United States, at least, the struggle for environmental justice is part and parcel of the struggle for racial equality. It is no accident that in the US, the environmental justice movement grew out of the civil rights struggles, and people of color have been at the forefront of the movement from the very start. There is a ProPublica video on YouTube, A Brief History of Environmental Justice, outlining the beginning of the movement in Warren County, all the way up to today. In the interest of time, I will just encourage you to turn to YouTube now it's 3 minutes and 36 seconds long, and just get a brief sense of the entanglement of community interest struggles and the legislative process and the ongoing kind of discrepancy in fair treatment. Indeed, pollution is segregated not only in the US, but also internationally. The global South bears an overwhelmingly disproportionate share of the burden, being literally a dumping ground of trash from the global North. In 2 years ago, in 2018, when China, which had been processing recycling about half of the world's trash, solid waste, decided to stop taking plastic and mixed paper waste, everybody had to scramble to find other, even poorer countries who would take our trash. Pope Francis calls this structural inequality on the global level an ecological debt that the global North owes to the global South. So this true ecological debt exists, according to Pope Francis, particularly between the global North and South, connected to the commercial imbalances with effects on the environments and disproportionate use of natural resources by certain countries over long periods of time. China has been generating its own vortex of pollution and ecological debt ever since it embarked on a path of capitalist market reforms after the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976, and the pace picked up especially after 1992. The average growth rate of the Chinese GDP from 1978 to 2017 is a whopping 12%. We probably all know that today, in nominal terms, the Chinese GDP is the second largest in the world. In PPP terms, adjusted for purchasing power parity, the Chinese economy is arguably the largest in the world. So as the graph you're looking at shows, as the GDP climbs, hikes, so does coal consumption. However, I wasn't able to find a chart showing the equal in tandem speed of the growth in the GDP and pollution, because the situation is slightly more complicated within China. Essentially, in a nutshell, the first-tier cities in China have already entered in post-industrial stage of development, and they are doing quite a lot, and so their numbers actually are quite promising, whereas there are other cities that are in China that are still experiencing the earliest stages of industrialization, and understandably, the numbers are not as good. So the correlation between development and pollution is a complex one. I'll be happy to talk more about it in the Q&A. But nonetheless, for the moment, the story, the point I would like to make is that the path of the industrialization that the Chinese leaders have pursued, interestingly, was one that was modeled after the US. Essentially, rapid economic growth driven by commercial real estate developments and the making and selling of consumer goods, especially automobiles and electronics. It is a quintessential carbon economy. We may all be familiar with the problems of smog, air, and soil pollution in China that made headlines every day. But a more serious environmental problem actually concerns water allocation and management. The problem of water is particularly urgent to China, which has 20% of the world's population, but only 6 to 7% of the total fresh water sources. By official reckoning, every year there are hundreds of incidents or riots or revolts staged by farmers and urban residents protesting land grabs, dumping of toxic waste, the building of incinerating plants, and water pollution from mining in the neighborhoods that threaten the health and livelihood of the people. I could spend the rest of my time and life actually talking about the environmental problems in China and the US-style environmental justice protests that they have spun. But that might get us too agitated or, frankly, depressed. So let us go to a park in Shanghai, the Hotan Park, and just to relax a little bit and to see if we can glimpse a different future. Listen to the wind blowing from the expressway to at least 3 levels of terraced broadwalks. I see that you can't hear my sound, I'm sorry, but so to our left was the expressway. Now we are moving down to the first level of the terrace broadwalk. You're looking at the second level. It's incredibly difficult to show the 3 levels that you would eventually see. The terracing concept is crucial. As bucolic as it may feel, I'm sorry that you didn't hear the wind and the children singing. As bucolic as Hotan Park may look, there is nothing natural about it. We may kind of briefly approach its history by following the course of the Huangpu River right here out there on which the Hotan Park was built. So flowing from the west to the east in an S-shaped band, the Huangpu River is the lifeline of Shanghai, which is China's first modern industrial city and home to about 24 million people today. First, the historic Chinese walled city, and then the colonial settlements, also called the Bund, developed on the shore of the Huangpu River, the Bund, and then the Chinese walled city. But primarily, these developments in the colonial period in the 19th century were found on the left bank or the west bank of the Huangpu River. as the as the 1935 map we have just seen on the upper right corner of the slide shows, overlapped onto this smaller map is a larger kind of tourist map of Shanghai that I picked up in 2018 that shows actually this whole area of development that was still farmland in the 19th and early 20th century. Essentially, the Hotan and Zhoujiadu neighborhood where the park you have just visited is located used to be rice fields, cotton fields, and vegetable fields in up to the early 20th century. In the mid 20th century, a steel factory and a shipyard were built there, but eventually abandoned because they didn't make any money. And before the area was chosen as the site of the 2010 Shanghai World Expo, it was a landfill and an industrial staging yard, basically a dumping ground for industrial waste. So today, what stands in the place of the landfill is a park, the Hotan Park, that is 34.6 acre big, an urban artificial wetland park with 3.2 with over 3 miles of pedestrian boardwalk and paths. Water and land come together in unexpected, almost deceptive ways. Water that was pumped from the Huangpu River and captured also from storm runoffs is crucial to the health of all of the life forms in the wetlands. But on the bamboo boardwalk that we have just walked on, the park goer can hardly see any water, only water plants, unless one walks down onto the lowest path on the river bank or come upon one of the ponds. Nor is there any hint of the man-made structures underneath the water. All the engineering, the brick terraces, the concrete boardwalk platforms, not to mention the masonry and stone tank, which releases the captured rainwater over an aeration wall into a series of filtering pools, are all hidden from sight. The terraced beds of the ponds, covered with prime soil, packed clay, and sand, became home to 28 species of carefully chosen water plants, for example, reeds, eelgrass, and water thyme that can grow in polluted water, and 22 species of fishes and shellfish introduced in 2009. Biodiversity, surprisingly, grew in less than 10 years' time. Researchers have since reported that they have found 93 species of plants and over 200 species of birds and animals hovering and growing and making a living in the park. So like natural wetlands, constructed wetlands or designed wetlands, artificial wetlands like the Hotan Park, serve multiple functions besides enhancing biodiversity and providing for recreation. The series of terraces in Hotan Park, bridging an 18-foot drop from the road to the river, are first and foremost a biological water treatment system. Every day, 660,000 gallons of polluted river water and storm water are released into the terrace pools. The plants and shellfish remove such pollutants as unionized ammonia, NH3, nitrate, NO2, nitrite, NO3, and nitrogen, TN, before the water is released back into the river. The numbers are promising, except for ammonia and hence TN. Water quality improved from a Chinese class 5 to 4, suitable only for industrial use, to class 3 to 2, suitable for drinking and aquaculture. The park is accessible from a miles-long biking and pedestrian walkway that connected to the newly built high-rise apartments in nearby neighborhoods. After work, and especially after dinner, families started to emerge as if out of nowhere for the daily walks. At dusk, I watched a mother teaching her son and daughter how to fish for crayfish with pieces of fatty pork, and they got one. I am convinced that this little guy was being chopped up for dinner after they went home. Although in the park, while walking on the pavement, we could not see an ocean liner sailing up the Huangpu River, we could hear the sound of its horn piercing the twilight, reminding the visitors that it was time to go home. The Hotan Park in Shanghai is so successful with planners and residents alike that wetland parks modeled after it have been built in numerous other Chinese cities. It crystallizes a palpable post-industrial designed ecology awareness among city planners and real estate developers in China today. The chief designer of Hotan Park is the 57-year-old visionary Kong Jianyu, the founding dean of the College of Architecture and Landscape Architecture of Peking University. A man of inexhaustible energy, Kong Jianyu worked his way from a farmer's family in a village in Zhejiang to college in Beijing, and then to Harvard's Graduate School of Design, where he received his doctoral of design before returning to China to open his private firm of landscape architecture called Tu-Ren in 1998. The firm now employs 600 architects, engineers, and managerial staff. When he returned to his village after he graduated from college, he found that the forests that had protected his ancestral home from storms were sold to developers and the trees were cut down. And the fresh fish he used to catch from the creek that flowed in front of his house were no more because the creek itself had turned into a gravel quarry. All the water had dried off. He thus became a rather unusual champion of environmental justice in China, while protesting governmental oversight and fighting the commercial real estate developers. He also managed to work within the system. And this is the most interesting point for me. He managed to harness wind resources from both within the government and private enterprises to build an entirely different kind of urban and rural settlement. The first part of the name of his firm, Tu-Renscape, Tu-Ren, Earth Human, is a pun. It means both a country bumpkin or man of the earth like himself, and a harmonious, sustainable relationship between nature, humans, and God. By God, Yu does not mean one from any organized religion, but, quote, the long cultural veins reaching deep into our local soil and our successive generations of ancestors, beginning, including ancient hydraulic engineers like the great Yu and Li Bing. Kong Jianyu's Tu-Ren vision, Earth Human, and practice is rooted ultimately in his rejection of the developmentalism that undergirds the policy of the post-socialist technocratic Chinese state since the early 1990s, a top-down approach that has littered the Chinese landscape with useless monumental buildings and ghost cities. So perfectly livable farmers' homes were demolished or snatched away and built into ghost cities that no one is living in. There are 64 million empty apartments in China, the last count as of 2 years ago. There is something wrong with this picture. Instead of, this drive to build, Kong Jianyu advocates what he calls negative planning or inverse planning, 反规划, which means to protect existing natural functions of the natural environment and prioritizing that which is not built. Very fascinating. Prioritizing that which is not built. Let's bring nature back into the Chinese cities instead of just built. In a 2014 letter to President Xi Jinping, Kong Jianyu pleaded, please put an end to the brutalist hydraulic engineering projects that are now rampant in both urban and rural areas, especially the channeling and damming of waterways. For those of you who've been following the news after a gigantic downpour in August of this year, the Three Gorges Dam reaches its highest flood peak in its history. And for a while, there was worry that it's actually going to burst and flooded all of the cities in downstream. It didn't happen, but the city of Chongqing, the old city, which you see here, was flooded 3 days after this picture was taken. Kong Jianyu sees kind of the relentless drive to build as Euro-American, Western in spirit. You may disagree, and I would love to hear what you think. In any case, he sees this as a mistake for China, based as it is on a relentless drive for man to dominate over nature and expressed itself in such exposed, fortified, and self-important structures as Mount Saint-Michel in Normandy, France, and in the concrete jungles, high rises in the metropolitan cities of the 20th century West and China. If the inexpensive and functional concrete is the material substrate of modernism in architecture, Yu is profoundly unimpressed by the gray city of stone and concrete, of steel and concrete that seeks to repel or resist nature and the false sense of security it engenders. Writing on the heels of the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, which was triggered by a 9.1 magnitude earthquake, which killed 227,000 people, Peng Jianyu warned that major destruction is the necessary trend of big development. Instead of looking for a Superman to save us, we should seek to revitalize the natural balance of our ecosystems by substituting a green architecture for gray architecture. The management of water lies at the core of green architecture infrastructure. China, like the rest of the world, is facing a rather contradictory water crisis. Melting icebergs and rising sea levels bring fears or the certainty of floods, while 420 out of over 660 major cities in China suffer shortages in clean water supply as rivers become polluted and lakes have become extinct in the face of rampant urban and industrial development. Yet, Yu found that it is futile to build an ark like Noah or repel water by building more dikes and flood wall, essentially by trying to ward off water, keep them from coming into our house. Instead, he advocates a completely kind of change in our thinking. The abandonment of the design blueprint of Gray City in favor of sponge city, in which land and water can co-mingle and where surface water and groundwater can interpenetrate. So invite the water into our built environment, but channeling it or redistribute it. The sponge is a metaphor for a resilient ecological city that enjoys the capacities of natural retention of rainwater, natural absorption of groundwater, and natural treatment of wastewater. The slogan, living with water. We have to learn to live with water and make it our friend. In China, as in elsewhere, Germany, Prince George's County, Maryland, there has been a sponge city movement on a global scale. So Yu Kongjian wasn't the inventor of this, but everywhere the sponge city pilot projects are only prototypes. They involve the building of specific contained neighborhoods instead of entire cities. It is far easier to pave roads with PAC or porous asphalt concrete to capture rainwater runoffs, purify them to reuse and redistribute to household taps, and to build artificial wetland parks such as the Hotan Park on waterfronts. It is far easier to do these remedial projects then essentially to remove all cement, gray infrastructure from old cities, from old neighborhoods, chase all the people away, resettle them, and build an entire shining sponge city from scratch. So admittedly, there's a strong utopian character to the concept and practice of sponge cities, built as they are on the wager that a wholesale remaking of the relationship between land and people by harnessing the productivity of wind and water is a reachable goal if we start by building one park and one neighborhood at a time. Kong Jianyu cites two pre-industrial practices that inspired his water center approach to post-industrial environmental design. Both of these practices are subjects of his own ethnographic fieldwork. One is the hydraulic engineering of terrace rice fields, and two involves the practice of Feng Shui, usually translated geomancy, or siting, literally wind and water. Mother Earth has provided enough spaces for humans to live, Yu Kongjian said, but we foolishly often choose to settle in places that no one should be living, such as fancy waterfront mansions, he signs. Learning from the resilience of ancient drilling and siting practices, Yu proposes that modern cities should be built on similar principles, the provision of security and food, sustenance, productivity, livelihoods to humans and animals. The ancient Han people were one such group of people. They are a non-Han ethnic minority group in China on the southwestern border. The Hanis were a migrant group who were forced to move south from the Qinghai Tibetan plateau. Notice this unhappy face marking the Qinghai Tibetan plateau to the southwestern edge of the Chinese Empire, and then driven from the valleys of the mountains in southern Yunnan to high up in Mount Anu, which is only about 30 miles north of the border between China and Vietnam. So some 1,200 years ago, they basically were forced to settle on the mountains, and they're still there today, numbering over 1 million people strong, sustained by the rice they grow on the terrace rice fields that have become spectacular tourist sites in the age of drone photography. But I have to say, all of the pictures that you are seeing are taken not by a drone, but by my husband. In Yuanyang County, a center of Han hamlets in Yunnan, 80% of the area is over 25 degrees deep. So water is impossible for water to occur. That's why you have to build them into terraces in order to be able to farm. So eking out a living in such precarious conditions, the Han people have developed ways of life, religion, and ethical beliefs that are premised on an environmental justice principle of communal sharing and self-restraint. Legends and time-honored practices divide the Ainu mountain, the lifeline, into 3 zones. The top zone at about 200 to 300 meters above sea level is the Dragon Mountain or the Ram of the Gods. The misty, tall peaks block the rising moist air from the Indian Ocean and serve as the source of the clear streams coursing downstream, downhill. The old growth forests that grow in the Ram of the Gods, called water source forest or Shui Yuanlin, are protected by the community. They cannot be cut down, nor can they be visited without explicit permission. The forests secure the soil, purify the air, and provide shelters for the wild animals. The middle zone is the dwelling zone of the humans, about 1,500 to 2,000 degrees, meters above sea level. Generations of honey communities have made home out of this tiny sliver of land. They organize their settlements into hamlets. Each hamlet consists of about 20 to 50 households, and these households would share the work of digging, repairing, and cultivating 1 to 2 terraced fields, which is extremely back-breaking work because the terraces keep collapsing and you have to keep shoring them up. And so the terrace fields are those you see underneath the ram of the humans. Rain and stream water are then channeled from the god's ram through the middle ram of the humans by way of actually regulating ditches. These are not natural streams. They are all ditches built and maintained by human labor. So as the streams, ditches rush downhill, the water carries organic fertilizers from the droppings of the animals and humans into the abundant fields. The trees, human settlement, paddy fields, and river drainage form a seamless ecosystem. Together, they co-produce honey, culture, and rice. Kong Jianyu considers the honey ecological system the exemplar of the ancient Chinese practice of Feng Shui, or siting, even though the honeys, as I said, are not Han Chinese people, but never mind, it's the same principle. He argues that Feng Shui is rooted in an universal primal human instinct, which is just to seek shelter and protection from the elements and from the wild beasts. The ideal type of human settlement is a cluster of houses nestled, hidden, protected in the basin of the mountain range, flanked by the wings of the mountain range, with streams of water flowing from the hills down to the villages before draining out, carrying the waste produced by the human and animals. Concealment, essentially being hidden from the elements and from your enemies. Concealment or self-defense is a fundamental Chinese cultural value, according to Yu Kongjian, along with sustenance and productivity, and the movement of water moving water is central to both. And that's why the crux of the environmental design for him is that instead of blocking water, bring them in, keep them moving, and we would protect ourselves this way. I would be happy to talk more about Feng Shui and sponge cities in the Q&A, but let's wrap up my talk with a last quote from Kong Jianyu. I want to think like a king, but act like a peasant. Think like a king, act like a peasant. What does that mean? I think that we are scholars, students, surely we know how to think like kings. We do it all the time. What does it mean to live like a peasant, act like a farmer? I think that he would have answered, first and foremost, it means to seek shelter and sustenance. Learn from the honey, the art of survival. It is a foregone conclusion that we live in the age of the Anthropocene, which is an age of precarity. More hurricanes are bound to come. The sea level would rise. We are still at the tail end of the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, which officially ends at the end of November. And we have had a historic number of storms and hurricanes. I think the highest number since 2005. It is wrong for China to aspire to build. It is wrong for China to want to build a US-style economy, which is a fossil fuel economy. In this, Yu Kongjian is an unflinching realist. But at the same time, he is also an optimist who believes that environmental justice, sustainability, and biodiversity are still achievable goals if all of us in the global north and the global south practice the 3 R's: reuse, reduce, recycle instead of waste. If all of us value the future as much as the present, and to make friends with water, to make friends with the floods, to make friends with the deluge, instead of building higher and higher retention walls. Many Chinese policymakers on the national, provincial, and municipal levels agree. The firm of Tu-Ren has completed over 600 projects in more than 200 cities to date. Some of them are in the US. I think there's one in Boston and another one in Seattle. And the State Council of the PRC has authorized the building of 30 pilot sponge cities throughout China. Most of them are being built. Some of them are nearing completion. So I just want to conclude and actually by asking, by way of making 3 points. History matters. 1. History matters in 2 ways. First, the structures of inequalities that we face today in the US and between the global north and the global south are products of at least 500 years of past history. But thankfully, history matters in a second way, in that valuable lessons and gems of wisdom about coexisting with nature have also been passed on from one generation of marginal people to the next. Farmers who work the exhausted soil, fishermen who cast the nets in polluted waters, women who gathered firewood from dying forests and draw water from deeper and deeper wells, and ethnic minorities being pushed to the edges of civilization. It is all too easy to cast them as victims. They are not victims. The poor and the dislocated should, in fact, be our leaders in the pursuit of environmental justice, because they have remarkable first-hand knowledge of climate change. As anthropologist cum novelist Amitav Ghosh says, a memorable quote, beautifully put, climate change has reversed the temporal order of modernity. The last shall be the first. Those on the margins are now the first to experience the future that awaits all of us. Ira Jackson, at home in Lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, is showing us the way to the future. Institution matters. I could have talked about other environmental justice organizations and efforts in China. The oldest, Friends of Nature, is an NGO founded in 1993 that focuses on education and legal advocacy, very similar to a number of US environmental justice groups. There is also, very excitingly, a thriving food justice movement in the Chinese cities and the countryside. And I've seen some remarkable farmers CSAs and communal kind of developments. But I chose to talk about Kong Jianyu because he is the most different in a sense. His approach points to the limits of our reliance on the agency and choices of individual subjects. The scale of environmental injustice is so enormous that we need concerted governmental and institutional action. In the US, the government is supposed to protect environmental justice by making and enforcing protection laws, and you can tell me how that is going. In Imperial China, interestingly, the government was legitimized only by a moral mandate, which means that it had to actively seek to redistribute wealth and resources from the rich regions to the poor regions. Otherwise, the people had the right to rebel. In this sense, the Chinese government is by nature a more activist one. It has to redistribute income. And to a certain extent, I myself would argue, this commitment to redistributing wealth and resources is carried over to the People's Republic of China, even in the present age of what I would call neoliberal state capitalist market reform. And this explains why Xi Jinping has openly committed to achieve zero carbon growth by 2060. To me, is not a propaganda sting, or not purely a propaganda sting. The Chinese leaders, from the central to the provincial and to the local level, has a very high degree of environmental awareness, because they somehow are aware they recognize that their own legitimacy depends on their cleaning up the act of pollution. So the public funds committed to the building of such green infrastructures as sponge cities is just one of the many examples of the open acknowledgement of the Chinese leaders and a consensus among both the urban and rural residents in society that environmental justice is a precondition for people's health, livelihood, and sustenance, and as a result, is a non-negotiable public good. I want to end by talking about the concept of culture that drives Yu Kongjian and my own work. Culture, in a nutshell, is fundamentally the co-production of humans and nature. To Kongjian, Yu, and the honey people, the pre-industrial world provides relevant models for constructing more sustainable relationships between man, humans, and nature. Instead of celebrating the domination over nature, human communities have to coexist with plants, animals, the rivers and the lakes, the stars, the moon, the sun, the wind, and the water, the floods, the deluge, in a co-evolutionary process. Culture, ultimately, is nothing other than this co-production between earth and land, the atmosphere, and humans and animals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. So we turn to the response of Anna Peterson.
And hi, everyone. I am going to, we have a little technical complications here. And so hopefully this won't be too choppy, but Terry is going to kindly be sharing the screen for me while I look at my notes on the other screen and ask him to change when we are ready. So Terry, could you please go to the next slide and then the next slide after that? To respond, I want to begin with, well, I guess what I should say first is that I've learned so much from Dr. Ko's presentation, and I am looking forward to some more questions and conversation after this. I'll be brief here. Dr. Hastie asked me not to do a traditional response addressing her specific points, but rather to expand the conversation by talking about some related themes in Western religious and cultural traditions about relationships to and ideas about nature. So in order to do this in an organized way, I'm going to focus on just a couple of the many issues that she raised in her presentation. Dr. Hastie proposed two questions in particular that I would like to focus on. But before moving into those two questions, I'm going to just go back to and highlight a couple of the themes that she highlighted. So first, her point that history matters, which I think is really important and interesting, and I love what she does with this, especially the way she highlights these two themes. On the one hand, history matters because the structures of inequality that we face today in China, in the US, anywhere, are the product of historical developments. Injustice is not inherent in human nature. It does not just appear magically. It's the direct consequence of human practices and relationships. But on the other hand, as Dr. Ko points out, history gives us not just injustices, but also ideas and communities and practices and wisdom, as she says, and lessons that can empower our work for justice and for a more environmentally sustainable future. So I just wanted to sort of highlight this. I'll come back to these in a little bit when I talk about ideas about nature in Western culture. Terry, could we go to the next slide, please? So the other themes that I wanted to highlight is, she said the role of government in an earlier version of this that I saw, which I switched to the role of institutions in this presentation, which I think is really interesting and broader. I appreciate the way that she has interwoven these themes about governance, about environmental justice, about culture, into her thinking about Chinese ideas about nature and environmental justice, and especially her attention to institutions. And this is related, I think, to her understanding of culture as the result of a co-production between the earth, the atmosphere, and people. And people are always involved, of course, in institutions. And so when we think about culture in this way, there's a materiality to culture that I think is very important if we want to understand environmental justice problems, how we've gotten to the situation we've gotten to, and how we might begin to address some of those questions and issues. So that's just my the themes I wanted to emphasize a little bit as a context for what I want to focus on in my response, which I'll keep quick so we have time for conversation. Terry, could we please go to the next slide? So I want to turn now to the two questions that Dr. Hastie asked me to address, and I've posted these here for you to read. And I won't read them all in detail, but basically one is about the idea that there are some pre-modern ideas, etc., that might still shape Western practices, just as there are those in China and other parts of the world that continue to shape contemporary ideas and practices. And then the other question that he asked me to address is how cultural conceptions of justice are defined in terms of consistencies and correspondences between the general and the particular. So I am going to spend a little bit of time talking about each of those. Terry, could we please go to the next slide? Thank you. So the first question asks about the lasting power of pre-modern ideas about religion and nature in the West. And even though it seems that modernity has erased everything that went before it, I think we can still look for and perhaps find traces and remnants of pre-modern cultures. And perhaps we can draw on them to rethink our relationship to nature and other people. Can we please go to the next slide? And so when I think about pre-modern ideas and modern ideas about nature and culture, I can't help but think about Lynn White, historian of medieval science, and his influential article published in Science in 1967 titled "The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis." And among the many arguments and issues that White packed into this very short essay, one of the most powerful and controversial was his claim that Christianity is, quote, the most anthropocentric religion that humans have ever known. And this is, its anthropocentrism or human-centeredness comes from its inability or perhaps its refusal to see spirit in nature, as White puts it. The absolute transcendence of Christian ideas about the divine prompted pre-modern Christians in Europe to cut down sacred groves, he says. So according to White, with the spread of Christianity, quote, the spirits in natural objects, which formerly had protected nature from man, evaporated. Man's effective monopoly on spirit in this world was confirmed, and the old inhibitions to the exploitation of nature crumbled. And as the quote on the slide summarizes, to a Christian, a tree can be no more than a physical fact. So I think what White's getting at here is that in the pre-modern period, the medieval period and what went up to that point, there were sacred groves, there was this idea of spirit and nature, and as Christianity, a particular version of Christianity, became more and more dominant, this idea of spirit and nature became more problematic to Christians who wanted to crush this because for them spirit was only in the divine, which was in heaven, and was abstract, separated from everything that was bodily and earthly. And so this particular version of Christianity, according to White, made it possible for people to cut down sacred forests and otherwise destroy nature in a spirit of, he says, indifference and even enthusiasm, encouraged by religious leaders who welcomed the removal of concrete symbols of natural power and natural divinity. So we have then this interesting notion that at the beginning, I don't know, Will is the expert on what constitutes modernity and pre-modernity, but for White at least, this medieval period, and there are material changes in farming practices and access to tools and technology. He's a historian of science and technology, but there are also ideological changes, and the particular Christian idea of where God is and what is sacred is really crucial to those changes. Could we please have the next slide, Terry? Thank you. So on the one hand, then, White seems to suggest that with the advent of modernity and the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, the Philosophical Enlightenment, all these things that went along with the rise of a particular version of Western Christianity that refused to see spirit in nature, well, sort of suggests that maybe the pre-modern, as he sees it, more sustainable, more relational approach to nature, the notion that nature might have spirit and sacred value, that all seems to have gone. And we have instead the replacement of this with this anthropocentric version of Christianity. But in fact, he doesn't dismiss Christianity entirely. And I think that this gives us a context for thinking about Dr. Hastie's question about whether any pre-modern ideas might still be alive. And I think another way to ask this is, what are our sacred groves and what are our ideas and practices about them? And what Lynn White might suggest, and as the quote on the slide here says, since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must also be religious, whether we call it that or not. And this is one of my favorite quotes from that article, that whether we call it that or not, because he suggests a broad definition and understanding of what might count as religion. And he also suggests that religion doesn't play one single role in mediating our relationships to nature, right? It can encourage us to destroy sacred groves, to deny spirit in nature, but it can also do other things. And he says that we can't just counter the sort of Western Christian attacks on nature by rejecting religion entirely. And I think here of Dr. Koh's point about history, how history gives us not just destruction and injustice, but also ways to resist these. And I think White is suggesting that religion also is part of this. And I think just for one example, we can look at the ways that some environmental activists today talk about natural agency, the idea that non-human places, animals, plants, bodies of water, trees are not just objects for human use, but have their own power and agency, what White might call spirit in nature. And so there are ways to value nature that do not just reflect the anthropocentrism of Christianity, and that give some moral and even spiritual value to natural places, whether that be national parks like Yosemite that are grand and have huge vistas and inspire awe, or corners of nature in our neighborhoods and our backyards that also can be places where we find this value. So I'm not sure if this really answers Dr. Hastie's question about lingering pre-modern ideas, but I think there are at least continuities, and I'd love to talk more about that and see what Dr. Hastie and others think. Terry, could we please go to the next slide? So now I want to just turn very briefly to the second question about that Dr. Hastie posed about how cultural conceptions of justice are defined in terms of consistencies and correspondences between general teachings of religion or culture, philosophy on the one hand, and culturally particular practices in specific times and places on the other. Could we please go to the next slide, Terry? I think one angle, just like, first I thought of Lynn White. Whenever I think about universality and universal principles, I can't help but think of Immanuel Kant. And up here on the slide is the formulation of his first categorical imperative: I'm never to act otherwise than so that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. And so this notion that Kant expresses here is this idea that there's only one, that something to be a moral law has to be universal, that we can't act morally if we are acting in culturally specific ways. And there's a lot more to be said about this, but we don't have time. But what I want to get at here is Dr. Hastie's question about how we balance the sort of Kantian notion of that ethics have to be universal with the reality that we don't live that way. We act on the basis of local and specific values, understandings about things like what's right, what's wrong, what does it mean to be a good human being, what is a good community, how should we relate to nature. And I think, the study of comparative religion, comparative culture shows us that there are endless answers to those questions, and that the kind of universal law that Kant aspires to is difficult. So my question then is, how can we mediate between some of these more general principles and the particular and local? And I think religion is a really good way to do that, because religion has big ideas and big values, and Dr. Ko has talked about that on the one hand, but on the other hand, religion also is always embodied and enculturated in specific times and places. And so if we could go, please, to the next slide, Terry. Finally, I gave you an image. Sorry for that boring PowerPoint. So a good example of this kind of mediation between the universal and the specific, I think, is Catholic teaching on environmental justice. And Dr. Ko mentioned Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change. And I think Laudato Si is a great example of the ways that Catholic teaching on environmental justice draws on global principles of Catholic social thought, long-lasting themes such as the goodness of creation, the universal destination of created goods, and the preferential option for the poor, which are foundational themes in Catholic social thought. And what Pope Francis and other Catholic thinkers talking about environmental justice do is use these big global or universal principles, universal at least for Catholics, to ground their thinking and their advice for action in concrete situations of injustice, and to think about environmental justice. And we see that, I think, really clearly in Laudato Si, which relates to the ecological challenges of climate change to environmental and social justice, and ties those together. And I'd be happy to talk more about Laudato Si, or what the universal destination of created goods mean, and things like that. But I want to wind up, since it's already 8 and I want to have time for discussion. This brings us back to, Terry, could you please, I'm sorry, go to the last slide? Thank you. So basically, to kind of wrap things up quickly, my goal in this response has been to place some aspects of Western culture and religious thinking about nature alongside Dr. Ko's look at some aspects of Chinese thinking about these issues. And so just a couple of quick points. First, that we need to keep in mind that every culture, including China, the US, the West, there's a big gap between ideas and practices. And while it's important to talk about the ideas and the values about sustainability and justice, we should not separate them from practices and institutions. And again, I so appreciate her focus on institutions and on the embodied way that these values in the parks and the other places that she's shown us, and in the demonstrations and the conflicts that show the concrete ways that ideas get embodied in particular ways, in particular practices. And then second, I want to point out that the relationship between ideas and practices is always complicated. It's never a simple linear or unidirectional relationship. They always transform each other mutually, so that in our practices, when we go to one of the parks that Dr. Ko has shown us, for example, our ideas change also. We don't just come with ideas and apply them somewhere, but our ideas change in the course of these practices, whether it's attending a protest or going to a park. So I think that's important as we think about, for example, the influence of pre-modern or any ideas on our environmental practices. And then last, real quickly, these practices and these ideas are always related to material structures and institutions and power relationships. And again, I think this connects to Dr. Teko's attention to the role of institutions and the ways those structure and mediate all our practices and our ideas, and that none of our thinking about nature, our practices towards nature, or about anything can take place outside this material and institutional context. So I'm going to wind up here. We can unshare the screen, Terry, if you'd like, and hopefully have time for some questions and conversation.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your response. Thank you, Dorothy. I think certainly we have a lot of things here to think about. A couple of the things I think that have stayed with me, and perhaps I can just put this to you and to Anna to sort of begin the Q&A, and then we can open up things a little bit more generally. But I was intrigued in both talks by this sort of sense of a call it an accounting or a debt to be paid or a redemption or whatever religious term we might want to use, but there has been a modus operandi, there has been a way of doing things over time that has brought us to a place which is not a good place and has in some way to be addressed. And in your talk and in Anna's response, one of the things that emerged was that perhaps even as this sort of indebtedness has been accruing, there has been, let's say, a reservoir of knowledge on the part of those who have been marginalized, who have been sort of sidelined or in some way, shape, or form have been disadvantaged, as the southern hemisphere has been, for example, by the northern hemisphere. So there's the idea somewhere in all of this that's intriguing to me of a garnishing or empowering or using in some way, shape, or form of ideas that are, for lack of a better word, traditional. I'm going to kind of try to keep it general. We could call it religious, traditional, etc. And what we seem to be doing is suggesting that these ideas of a religious kind or an ethical kind or that pertain to this past history, but particularly to the history of those who maybe have been kind of pushed aside, that there's something in that is still applicable and still perhaps essential, if not crucial, to addressing the situation that we're in. In other words, if I said before that there's a need for some, call it redemption. I realize I'm coming from a sort of Midwestern Protestant United States background, so I would maybe, but there's like a debt somehow to be paid. It seems that all of us need to recognize that we've had a role in playing that this has come about, and we have this knowledge perhaps that has been gained from people who have perhaps been on the victim side of this. There seems to be something interesting that's happening, and it is I mean, what I'm struck by is kind of a disjuncture almost of the traditional forms of knowledge, implementing them now again anew, so to speak. In other words, it's as if there is this kind of sense, call it a religious sense, that has existed in the past of a debt to be paid, and however conceived in whatever religious terms it's articulated, that has to be addressed, and some sort of wisdom attached to how to address that. But in the times that we're in, it seems like what we begin to see, the examples that you were talking about of you and this park in Shanghai, and using the wisdom of the Hani, but really using it, it seems, in a very different way, right? It's kind of like extracting something from a traditional setting, isolating it, taking it, and then putting it putting it to practice in this small area in Shanghai. This is basically, I apologize, I'm being very wordy about this, but I'm struck both by the sense, the kind of continuity, which is perhaps largely negative because leading in the direction of this kind of need for some kind of redemption on the one hand, but tools being there that are available for some kind of accounting, traditional tools, but that those traditional tools have to be isolated, so to speak, to some degree, or it seems they are being isolated from the original context in which they were embedded, and let's say implemented in new situations, creating teeming life in this park, for example, which I found very interesting. But it's this double aspect of a sort of debt to be paid that perhaps is coming through with me very strongly because of a kind of a Christian background that I have and an idea of sin. But also informed by kind of where we are environmentally, and being aware that where we are environmentally has to do, to a large degree, with having sort of proceeded in ways that have brought us to where we are, and knowing that none of us are completely innocent. So I'll stop with that and just kind of put that to you as something to respond to. I hope Anna's still with us. Perhaps she'll be back in a second. And
there is a question, or actually two questions, that came from the audience. I wonder if Anna would like to address it.
So, Will, that was, I have to confess, I lost a little bit of the train of your question and your reflections, and I don't want to be too wordy. Can you maybe give me one sentence version of your question?
Implementation of so if the solutions to the problems that we have to deal with today are, if not religious, some version of religion, how is it that that's something that can be accomplished? It seems that there's a rupture or a disjuncture, or there's some kind of gap, and it's an interesting one for me, because what it seems to suggest is that there is this, call it ancient wisdom, call it pre-modern wisdom, call it an understanding how the earth works, that maybe we've lost track of, but we can get hold of again. When, where, and how, what are the circumstances whereby we might be able to kind of use that again as a tool, but in framing the question the way I'm doing it, it's kind of like we're taking it from its original context, right? And we're using it like in completely new ways. And that was sort of what the direction that my question was going in.
Great. Yeah, let me just try and be brief. And I think I'm looking at the question here from anonymous attendee about liberation theology in the health and medical context, saying she asked this because I referenced a preferential option for the poor, which is indeed a tenet of liberation theology. So I think, Will, what you're talking about in terms of how we can implement is a crucial question. And I would say, looking back at liberation theology, gives us an example, right, of how religious ideas that are developed in various places get embodied and enacted in actual communities. And I think it's very complicated. I think it never works to simply tell people do something and then they do it. And that's one reason that I think religion can be effective more than some secular philosophies, in terms of always being a lived ethic, right? And a lived worldview, and being embodied in institutions and practices. So I agree with you, Will, that it's problematic to think about an implementation of ideas in a simple way. I don't think there's any magic solution. And I think, as I said before, you know, the relationship between ideas and practices is always so complicated. It's never, you know, there's always unintended consequences, right? And Max Weber was the, you know, master of thinking about this. I'm trying to be quick. Why don't we let Dr. Ko answer this question directly for her, and then, you know, we can come back to this. But I'm aware of the time, and I don't want to monopolize.
Let me read the question. This is from for you, Dr. Ko, from Steve Corey. Thank you for the talk. I very much appreciated your weaving of certain notions connected to Feng Shui with the work of Hong Jianyu. I was wondering if you can comment a bit more on the degree to which Hong Jianyu explicitly draws from Feng Shui traditions, or Feng Shui is either implicitly or explicitly connected to environmental movements in China today.
Thank you, Steve. Actually, Hong Jianyu has a very different understanding of Feng Shui than most Chinese architects or practitioners. He, when he was a graduate student in China or college student in China, he actually went to maybe scores of Feng Shui sites, mostly graves and ancestral homes in different parts of China, to actually study how the Feng Shui masters or the people at the time conceptualized the relationship between human settlement and the mountains and the flow of water and the wind and the air and so on. So I find that really fascinating. He, of course, is very skillful in then translating those mystical ideas into actual embodied material practice that can garner, actually, that can win projects today. So that's my, he is quite a fascinating thinker. And if I can, are there other questions? Because I have spoken so much, I would love to hear from other people in the audience, your thoughts, your comments, even it doesn't have to be a question.
One of the things, I think one of the things that we were interested in doing, and certainly that we did accomplish to some degree, I think, is look at, we're trying to be transcultural, transdisciplinary, right? And I think we really successfully sort of had to some degree a view of things that had Asian perspectives and Occidental perspectives, and it seems that is there a difference in the concerns, given that we're going to have to be probably in some way, shape, or form acting on a global level, affecting transitions from local traditions that are so diverse. If we're going from traditions informed by Christianity, for example, in the West and the Occident largely, if we're moving from moving from much different religious traditions in China, for example, where that relationship, which you were just describing to some degree, with the sort of the interrelatedness of traditional beliefs with a kind of marketability in the Chinese context. What I'm looking for if possible, are ways of addressing challenges that face everybody, but recognizing still these individual differences that you have, where, for example, in China, you could market, you could bring to investors in China ideas that are much more grounded in traditional thinking, and whereas in the West, that would be probably a much harder sell, I would think. But maybe I'm wrong.
I think that I would like to just encourage the attendees to go to participant and use the raise hand function to speak up, because we would really like to hear from you. Because otherwise you are stuck with me answering Will, which would take another lifetime.
Yes, if anybody would like to speak aloud, the attendees, there's a raise hand option at the bottom, and we will see your hand is raised, and then one of the panelists may call on you, and you can ask your question aloud if you'd like.
I see one raised already.
Please.
Dana Lin.
Hi, is my audio working?
Yes.
Okay. I thought what you were saying about environmental justice was really interesting, and I agree that it is a very worthy and noble goal to have. I was wondering whether you thought it's practical in the current current society, because I'm taking another class where we're reading about the health effects of just, I guess, like the industrial culture we live in, and like society on a whole is being sort of, I don't know, we're kind of like drowned in all these chemical and physical contaminants as a whole, and like we can't even prevent, I guess, like people who, just anyone from being exposed to these. So would you, yes, so is environmental justice practical, I suppose, in that regard?
Maybe I can take Yana on, and then Anna and Will and Terry can join. To me, I think it's not so much a matter of whether something is practical or not, but whether something is right or not. And I think that in part what Professor Hastie is trying to think through is what are the philosophical, conceptual, or ethical grounds on which we can say you should do something, you should not do something. This ultimately is perhaps what justice means, but when it's entangled so much with the inequalities of power, then the situation becomes a lot more complicated. My own wager is that industrialism is a contained and containable stage of human development. It will come to pass. In many cities in China, such as Beijing or Shanghai, just like us, have already entered a post-industrial stage. So surely our environment is contaminated, our air is polluted, but it doesn't mean that it will have to keep on developing that way. So the reason why I spend time putting this talk together and think it through is that I just think that there are so many ideas out there that can point to a different ethical relationships, different forms of dwelling and different ways of being in the world. I am a pragmatist. I never worry about Will's worries. How do we translate from the local to the universal? Let you worry about it. But I am interested in generating operationable ideas from the local. It's already happening. People are already trying. There are a group of villagers in Shunyi, in the a suburb of Beijing, further away from the old airport, not the new one. They have formed a co-op whereby they only eat food that they grow themselves. They teach each other's children. They only wear things that, from cottons woven in human hands. There are all of these, we might want to call them utopian ideas that are being practiced by real people that seem to point to a very different future than industrialism. So I'm just a storyteller. I'm interested to know what their stories are. What are their emotions and experiences? What compel very normal people in selling their apartments in the high rises and go do this? These people are real. So I guess my answer is that industrial culture will come to pass. It's up to us to want to build a different future, because that is not sustainable. It's that simple.
I see, yeah. I think like part of the problem is also that the people who have more access to resources that could, like healthcare, won't feel the full impacts of things, of like the result of environmental injustice, whereas Dr. Peterson mentioned like how I think like Catholic liberation theology and how like the poor were preferred, so whereas the poor don't have access to like things like that, so maybe like so environmental justice is still worthy cause.
Yeah, I think that, the reason why we have not turned into so-called climate refugees, the reason why we have not, I hope that we have not, maybe some of us have been, chased away from our homes because it got flooded, is because we are relatively privileged. There are people who live on the margins who don't have that privilege. So it's very real to them. And what Amita Ghosh has managed to turn it around in my head is by saying it. Before we think that we intellectuals are the vanguard in the sense that we are at the forefront of change, but in fact, for the first time, the order is reversed. It's the poor and the disenfranchised who have seen the future before all of us. So we're not doing it for them because they are victims of our waste. We are doing it for ourselves because They see it, they are imperiled while we have the chance. Let's do something.
Hi, Dorothy, this is Terry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to chime in right there because I was thinking about something that's very relevant to what I think you're just talking about. I cherish the notion of encouraging the organic, spontaneous development of intentional communities that choose ways of life that are meaningful to them in their locale. That doesn't change, and I'm not challenging what you've said, but it raises this issue. It doesn't change the fundamental, which is that there are these deeply rooted inequities, these disparities in both consumption and the production of the detritus of consumption by any measure, right? Whether that be garbage or whether it be greenhouse gases. And I wanted to ask something specifically about the Chinese context because I'm not familiar with it in this way, but let me give you a number because Oxfam produced a report just about a week ago in which they concluded that between 1990 and 2015, the top 1% of the world's economic elite produced twice as much in greenhouse gases as the bottom 50%, right? The disparity is even hard to comprehend. I don't know what the number is contained within the United States, but my sense is it may not be so extreme as that, but that it is comparably extreme. Those at the top of the economic system here are producing far more greenhouse gases than those who find themselves dispossessed by our existing economic and then therefore sort of racial and class inequities. Is there an awareness within China today? Is there a comparable disparity between those at the top and those who are struggling at the bottom? And is there an awareness of that generally? And is there a recognition that that needs to change in order for the bottom to be brought up to a higher standard of living? I'm just curious about whether this fundamental injustice of our economic system has any corollary in a comparable injustice in the Chinese system.
Good question. That allows me to call out the elephant in the room, and that is capitalism.
It's bigger than an elephant, Dorothy. It's the brontosaurus in the room.
What's hovering behind you? I think that this is very interesting. In the talk, I have just quickly referred to the form of capitalism that is practiced in China today as a form of state capitalism. The notion came from sociologist Jingguan Li, who studied the investment of Chinese companies and the state in Zambia in their mining operations. So what Jingguan Li means by state capitalism is that it is a system whereby the state mandates other kinds of values than just pure profit. These values to the Chinese state include equity, environmental justice, and actually creating jobs specifically for the subaltern. Subaltern is a formal word that they use, as well as the eradication of poverty. These are all part of the official goals of the Chinese state. Never mind that supposedly by the end of 2020, they are supposed to have eradicated the most rapacious form of poverty in China. I don't think they are able to do it. Nonetheless, I think that there is a difference between state capitalism of the Chinese stripe and, if I may say so, our kind. The late capitalist mode that we're in mandates to drive the bottom line and for the maximization of profit. I don't know if I can put it in any other terms. which is very different from state capitalism of the Chinese kind. And this is why I hinted at the possibility that the Chinese leaders, they are not benign, but there is the old political economic notion that if you don't at least try to redistribute income and wealth and resources, the people are going to rebel. They will not vote you out of office because they only vote in local elections, but they will, make sure that the voices are heard. So I think that it's entirely, anyway, let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Dorothy Ko. Thank you very much, Anna Peterson. Appreciate so much your being willing to be involved in this first webinar of our symposium this semester. We have a lot more fun coming in our direction over the next few weeks. We have in the chat box along the way, we have posted websites for the events, for the remaining 3 webinars, and for the Poetry Slam. So you'll be able to find information there. At this point in time, I think we have, we're actually beyond our allotted time period. So it's time to close. I'd like to thank all of you, all of the attendees for making time to come this evening. And again, thank you so much, Dorothy Ko, for being willing to be our guest. It was so nice to hear you talk about your new areas that you're working on. And Anna, thanks also for providing us with the perspectives that you provided us. And I hope to see many of the attendees who came this evening next week, when, in fact, it will be a week from today at 6:30 with Andrea Jury, who will be speaking about a different part of the global situation with respect to environmental justice. So with that, I will bid everyone adieu, and hopefully see all of you next week. And again, thank you so much, Dorothy.
Thank you very much.